Yo, what's going on, snipers? And yes, welcome to another roster build overview. So basically, after I finished my 2003-04 roster that you guys saw last time, and hopefully you downloaded it by now, I decided to make a 2005-06 roster build directly from that. So basically, there's only a few changes into it. Obviously, the rosters are different, so I had to move around players to teams that they were actually on at 2005-06. I had to remove guys that retired and add guys that got into the league that weren't in my 2003-04 build. So there is some minor changes with that. Also, there's a couple changes in terms of, for example, here as you can see the Anaheim Mighty Ducks. I found a new logo. Well, somebody mentioned it, and it looks a lot closer to the actual Anaheim Mighty Ducks logo than the duck I was using like before, like the web foot. So this is going to be the logo on the Mighty Ducks jerseys. A couple other changes in this roster build include some new AHL teams because, for example, in 2003-04 build, I had to make 2 All-Star teams, and in 2006 there was no All-Star game because of the Olympics that were taking place in Turin, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken. So I didn't have to add all-star teams this time around, so I did add a few AHL teams that I was going to add to my 2003-04 build, but I ran out of space in terms of the creation suite. So as you can see, there is now like the Bridgeport Sound Tigers, so you could replace Bridgeport with the Bridgeport Sound Tigers instead of having them being the Bridgeport Islanders. There's a couple other teams that are new into this build. That being, for example, the Greenville Growl, which were actually an ECHL team. It's just basically because Edmonton needs to have an AHL affiliate because in real life, I believe they were sharing an AHL team still with Montreal or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I had to give them their own AHL team. So I basically called up their ECHL team, which was the Greenville Growl, and that is going to be their AHL affiliate. Also, another team that you guys saw here, Florida Everblades, another ECHL team that had to get called up just because the Florida Panthers were sharing an AHL team in Rochester with the Buffalo Sabres at this point in time. So basically those two teams were added just because of the fact it makes it a little bit more realistic for each team to have their own AHL team, because I can't have the same team sharing an AHL affiliate. Like I can't have both Buffalo and Florida sharing Rochester like they did in real life. And there was a couple other teams that are new into this build, like the Iowa Stars, who are going to be replacing the Utah Grizzlies from my 2003-04 build. So they're Dallas's AHL affiliate. And then the final new AHL team that I added is the Peoria Rivermen, who are St. Louis's AHL affiliate. They are replacing the Worcester Ice Cats. I think it's pronounced Worcester. Yeah, Worcester Ice Cats. So they aren't in this build anymore, but you do have the Peoria Rivermen for St. Louis. And yeah, there's a lot of relocation and changes with these AHL teams from 2003-04 to 2005-06. If you needed any help on how to set these up in terms of franchise mode, you just need to go to basically to my website again, and there'll be a setup page on how to set this up for 2005-06, so you have the correct affiliates being accurate to their actual NHL team at that point in time. So just keep that in mind. Also, I did add the Philadelphia Phantoms to replace Lehigh Valley, so there is a couple other AHL teams I almost forgot about. Syracuse Crunch, so you have a more of a Blue Jackets look than the one that is in the game that looks more like the Tampa Bay Lightning and that type of thing. So there's a few new teams, which is nice, so you get a few new jerseys. And yeah, obviously there is some new players. Let's go through the rosters briefly. Not going to go super in depth with this like I did with the other ones, just because it makes sense to not have this video being super long. But let's start off with some of these AHL teams and NHL teams. So Ari Honen's still down there in the minors for New Jersey for one more year. Then you go to the Anaheim Ducks. Here's what their forward core is looking like, led by Timo Solani, who is back in Anaheim and back in high overall. If you guys remember in the 2003-04 build, he was in Colorado and he was like an 86 because he was not that good this year. Well, 2005-06, he had a really great year coming back to Anaheim. So he's only on a 1-year, $1 million contract, but then he actually has an extension because obviously he was there till like 2013-14 afterwards. But I also did have to adjust some of the salary cap on some of these teams because some of these teams were over the $39 million max cap hit that teams had in this point in time. So I did address a couple teams in terms of the salary cap. So you might see some guys making like $500,000 less than they actually did. And that's just because of I want them to be cap compliant and whatnot. So some teams have like $0 in cap space Others have like only a few $1 million, so just keep that in mind. But like I said, the setup is all on the website, so you guys will be able to know how to set it up for franchise mode so it works out properly. Once again, you have to use custom league for this roster build, so just keep that in mind. So yeah, there's some interesting players getting added. Obviously, guys like Hanyu Toivonen worked in the 2003-04 build, but he's in the 05-06 build. You got some really weird things like Brian Leach in Boston, which to me is still one of the weirdest things. It's not as weird as him in Toronto, I'd say, but still, it's really weird. And yeah, you got some very interesting looking teams. Boston was really rough at this point in time. Obviously, they just traded Joe Thornton, so you got Wayne Primo over there. You also have Marco Sturm and none other than Brad Stewart. So this is right after the deadline, basically. So also keep that in mind. A couple other AHL goalies added. Wade Dublowitz, since he actually played some games in the NHL that season. I didn't address his jersey number, so that's why it says he's number 3. So I'll probably address that before I actually put this, roster build out, so that they have accurate jersey numbers in the AHL still too. But NHL wise, they'll have it accurate at least. Here's a pretty good Buffalo team, and one that kind of surprised me because obviously they knocked out my Sens in 05-06. I don't like to think about that, but I remember the Jason Pominville goal easily. Yeah, this Buffalo team, really solid team, but Ottawa was so good during the regular season that they basically beat them by, like, I think they had like 10 goals against them or something like that, and like 2 or 3 players had hat tricks in that game, which was kind of nuts. So yeah, that's that. And then Calgary obviously kind of falling off after going to the Stanley Cup Finals before the lockout. And there's that. Kiprusoff being a 92 overall, I believe is the highest rated goaltender just because he did win the Vezina that season. And then you have the interesting team of the Carolina Hurricanes. I have Cam Ward only as a 79, even though he was a great playoff goaltender in his rookie season. He was not a great regular season goaltender, so that's the reason why he's only a 79. But 79 sim really well in franchise mode, so maybe he can carry Carolina to a Stanley Cup if they don't have Martin Gerber. But yeah, this team obviously won the Stanley Cup back in 06, led by a young Eric Stahl, who was really good this season. He had over 100 points, if I remember right. So there's Carolina. Chicago, which obviously at this point in time, Chicago was pretty terrible. So you got some good pieces, still like a young Patrick Sharp and whatnot, but other pieces not so much. Like, for example, Mark Cullen, who's Matt Cullen's older brother, I think it is, or maybe he's his younger brother. Either way, he's not really an NHL player at all, but he was on their team. They also had like Vorobiev, Holmquist, Bochenski, so it's like you can see this team is not really that good, and especially on the defensive front. Like, you do have some good potential players on the back blue line, for example, like Seabrook, you have Keith, Bufflin. And then goalie-wise, Hebby Bullen really dropped off after his Stanley Cup win in Tampa Bay. So he's down to an 84, and I believe in the roster build prior to this, he was like an 89 or 88 or something like that, maybe an 87. You have Nolan Schaefer in the minors for San Jose, Peter Schaefer's brother. Jose Theodore in Colorado, because he was dealt to Colorado this year for David Abisher. So an interesting looking Avs team here. I'm actually just go by forwards. Joe Sakic still really good at this point in time at 36. Or 35, one of the two, I don't know what it is, because this game has a little bit of a glitch here where it shows one age and then it's inaccurate. We go to the Columbus Blue Jackets here. Sergei Fedorov in Columbus is a really weird time period as well. Not as, I'd say it's definitely weirder actually than in Anaheim in Washington, but still kind of a weird roster build in terms of a few players. Like, Columbus has some really bad players in the lineup, like Ballistic never played really much in the NHL. You also have Steven Gertz, and this guy barely played in the NHL. Probably mispronouncing that name, but whatever. And then Adam Foote in Columbus, also kind of weird, because obviously you always think of the Colorado Avalanche when you think of him. Martin Prusik over there is kind of weird too. Dallas, Marty Turco. Not as good of a year for Marty Turco in the Dallas Stars in terms of their goaltending, but they've had some good pieces. And they're definitely I'd say they were definitely one of the teams that could have won the Stanley Cup this season, but they were knocked out, I'm pretty sure, by the Colorado Avalanche in the first round, which was kind of like an upset in a sense. You also have like UC Okinen making his debut in this roster build, obviously known for his shootout specialty. We go to Detroit. This team was absolutely gross. So if they win in year number 1 in franchise mode for you, you know why. Young Pavel Datsyuk and whatnot. Still some really good players there. Yzerman's in his last year of his career. Just nuts. But for some reason, like all these players, even though I make them, some of them like 44 years old, Chris Chelios won't retire in year 1. For some weird reason, creative players never retire in year 1. So you'll never see like Chris Chelios retiring right out of the gate. You'll see him retire probably in like year 2, my guess. But it'd be kind of neat if he ended up playing till like 50 years old. Here's the Edmonton Oilers, who obviously went to the Stanley Cup Finals that year. Very solid team. And they added some great pieces. Obviously, like guys like Ryan Smith are in his last year with the Oilers. So there's some players that obviously left this team after the Stanley Cup run. Sergei Samsonov was in Edmonton at this point, which is kind of weird. That type of thing. We head to... I don't think I added anybody for Florida Everblades, did I? Oh yeah, just J.M. Peltier. This guy's just an AHL goaltender, so he's just there for more depth in this build, just so there's something. And then Florida, Roberto Luongo was absolutely insane. So he's got like 0 out of 2 consistency. And he's only got 1 year left on his deal because he was dealt to the Vancouver Canucks, obviously, in a big trade that happened in the offseason of 06. So Luongo could be a big name free agent for you in terms of year number 1 that you could sign up. When I did a little bit of a test run, he signed with the Washington Capitals, which was interesting because Washington obviously wasn't doing too well in their first year, but then they drafted Jonathan Toews in year 1, and then they decided to sign none other than what's his name? None other than Roberto Luongo. So. Oh yeah, also I forgot to mention a few things. Devan Dubnyk, he wasn't in the AHL in 2006. He was still back in junior, but in order to have these guys actually mean something in franchise mode, I had to give them contracts for their NHL teams already. So you have like Tuukka Rask in Toronto, that type of thing. It's only just because they're also like guys like Carey Price and whatnot won't show up as unsigned players. So you have them in the AHL even though they weren't in the AHL technically at this point in time. So just keep that in mind why like guys like Anton Khudobin's in the minors for Minnesota, even though he wasn't till like 2009, I'd like to say. You still have like Mike Smith and Dan Ellis down there for Dallas. Los Angeles, Matthew Guerin, Jason LaBarbera. Not the best LA team, but you have like Lubomir Visnovsky, who usually simulates really well. Like him and Corvo, I saw them in a simulation, somehow put up both like 50, 60 points in a season. Like both of them could have won the Norris in 1 year, which was kind of nuts. I don't know why Joe Corvo simulates as good as he does, but he's pretty damn good. And yeah, this is a little bit of a weird LA team with Pavel Demitra being over there. And Jeremy Roenick and whatnot. Young Dustin Brown. George Peros being in the lineup. Goalie-wise for Manchester, there's a couple of guys. You can see I added Fugafuji again like I did in my 06-07 build from last year, because why not? Wade Flaherty and a couple of goalies down there in the minors for Manitoba. Massachusetts doesn't have anybody. That's Lowell again, just in case you didn't know. That's Carolina's AHL team at that point in time. Minnesota, young Josh Harding, the backup to Fernandez, because Rolson was dealt obviously to Edmonton. It's kind of weird because Alex Henry, this guy, he shared the captaincy with a bunch of other players. Like, I didn't give him a letter in this build, but he honestly could have been a captain of the Minnesota Wild because he shared it with, like, Kuba, I think it was, and a couple others. Got a young Brent Burns still in the lineup. Derek Bugard's on this team, so this is, like, one of the first roster builds I think I made Bugard in, so rest in peace to Derek Bugard. And, yeah, Todd White in Minnesota is a bit of a weird one, too. So there is Minnesota. Then we head over to Montreal, led by Kovalev and Koivu, pretty much. A solid team that got knocked out by the Carolina Hurricanes, I think it was in round 1. Defensively, Andrei Markov, some pretty solid pieces there in Montreal. Goalie-wise, Huey and Abisher. And then, obviously, like I was saying, you have like Carey Price and Halak in the minors. So Montreal's got a lot of good goaltending options. Nashville, pretty solid team here. Kind of weird seeing Brendan Witt as a Predator. And also kind of weird still seeing Paul Kariya as a Predator, even though he was like that in my 06-07 build. But yeah, a lot of these players should end up being free agents during their actual time that they were free agents. So it's pretty accurate in that sense when I was doing my test sims. Patrick Eliash leading the Devils. Obviously, the Devils were kind of trending backwards a little bit, like 06-07s when they got knocked out by the Sens in the second round. And obviously, the defensive core becoming a little bit more barren once Scott Niedermayer, Scott Stevens is retired, Ken Danico. So you got like a couple good pieces still, but then you have like Ken Klee, Luka Witch, Matt Tkachuk, and Hale that aren't really that great. They're average. You also still got Broder, who's still going to be a 92. The only reason is because he had some great years prior to this, but obviously he was starting to trend back a little bit in terms of his play. New York Islanders, Rick DiPietro has his enormous extension. Yep, enormous extension. I gave him 15-year extension at $4.5 million. This was the last year before he actually signed that. Technically, he didn't sign it until September, but I wanted to make sure he had that large extension in place, just so that way, if you're doing the Islanders, you're going to be stuck with him for a long time, unless you could offload his contract, which I don't know if I've seen anybody try to do that yet with my roster builds, so... But yeah, this is a fun year for sure. A lot of players that I never made before, also like Robert Nilsson, for example, which is good because I am working on a spreadsheet that has like every single player I've ever made's facial information. So once that is out, you guys will be able to make any player I've ever made in terms of their facial details. It won't have their equipment details, but I will probably end up doing an equipment type of thing as well at some point. I'm trying to just make as much roster related stuff as possible so you guys have so much like tools at your disposal. Young Henrik Lundqvist in his first season as an 85, just because I didn't want to make him too good out of the gate. Even though he was fantastic in his rookie season, I just didn't want him to make him like a 90 overall and then all of a sudden he becomes like a 99 overall goaltender. I think 85 at high elite potential. He should be able to get easily into the 90s in his career. Also, you got to revamp look for the Norfolk Admirals, who have more of a Chicago look this time around, with Corey Crawford in the minors. Omaha's got Curtis McElhinney, which once again is Calgary's AHL affiliate. Ottawa, Dominic Hasek there is always really weird, but it was a good time period for the Sens. Obviously, like I said, one of the best teams in the NHL, but the only problem is Dominic Hasek got injured at the Olympic break, and obviously then the Sens had to rely on Ray Emery, who's not still that great, and then you also have Mike Morrison, who's not really an NHL goaltender, so you can kind of see why the Sens kind of struggled in terms of getting far in the playoffs that year, because they had to rely on a young Ray Emery, who was better in 06-07, and Mike Morrison, who, like I said, was not an NHL goaltender. But look at how good this team was. This team should have won a Stanley Cup in 05-06. If Hasek didn't get injured, I think this team definitely would win it. But you never really know. Martin Havlat's still there before he went to Chicago. Smolinski's still there. Like, a lot of these guys end up leaving after the season, which is disappointing. But it's a really, really good team over there in Ottawa. Or here in Ottawa, I should say. And then you have Merrick Schwartz in the minors for St. Louis already. Just because I couldn't put him as an unsigned guy. Philly's not got a great goaltending combination. Esch and Inamaki, both of them are not great, but you do still have a solid team in front of them, so they might simulate better than they look. And you have Peter Forsberg in Philly, which is interesting. Obviously, he would have been dealt to Nashville the following season. So there's all that. A lot of good young players there still in Philly, though, like Umberger, Richards, Carter. So if you do Philly, you at least have some good players to build around. We head to the Philadelphia Phantoms, which they have Jamie Storr, surprisingly, the former NHL goaltender. He was now a career AHL goalie at this point, and you have Martin Houle as well. Phoenix, led by Curtis Joseph between the pipes and pretty much nothing else. Philip Sauve is not that great, and then David Lenevue is more of a career AHL goaltender. So, yeah, this Arizona team or Phoenix team, not very great. Not very great at all. I mean, Shane Doan and Nagy and Comrie, those type of players, Johnson, not bad. But then you get into like their bottom six, and yeah, it's not as good. Like, you do have some solid veterans, but yeah, it's not a great team there in Phoenix. That was actually a team that Wayne Gretzky coached, which is interesting. And in Pittsburgh, obviously, you have a rookie year, Sidney Crosby, who's an 88 high franchise at 18. I had to make him a high overall out of the gate just because I wanted him to get like 100-point seasons and become an insane player. So he should develop easily to being like a 96 plus overall in franchise mode. But it's kind of weird seeing like Ziggy Palffy in Pittsburgh, John LeClaire, and a bunch of other solid young players. So this would also be a fun team to probably rebuild. in a sense, because you have the pieces in place. You just need to add around it. Obviously, I couldn't make Malkin like a prospect for the Penguins just because of the creative player limit, but if EA ever ups that, you know I will be making these builds even more in depth than they already are. Portland is now Anaheim's AHL affiliate. That's why Yanni Herme is down there. They are not affiliated with the Washington Capitals anymore. I think it was. Yeah, Washington. The Rampage. What else we got here? San Jose, Toskala, and Nabokov. Nabokov had a really rough year this season. That's why he's down in overall. Toskala was actually a lot better than Nabokov, but I didn't want them to be the same overall because when I did a test sim, for some reason, the San Jose Sharks immediately traded Nabokov. They still might end up doing that if you do a franchise mode, but I just didn't want them to trade Nabokov. I wanted them to trade Toskala instead, so it would be more realistic. Because obviously he went to Toronto, I believe, the season after this, or 2 years after this. I think it was 2 years after this. And then you can see in San Jose, Joe Thornton, Marlowe, and Chichu's only an 87, but only because he was kind of like a one-season wonder. But he did score a lot of goals after his 56-goal season at points too. But he does have like really good shooting categories, so he should still score like 40-plus goals in a franchise mode, especially next to a great playmaker like Joe Thornton. But yeah, the San Jose team's pretty good. And there's that. We head to the Springfield Falcons, who are now Tampa's AHL affiliate. You got Gerald Coleman and Kari Ramo. Like I said, if you have any trouble setting these up, like the AHL affiliates, like I said, check out my website, or you could even ask me down below in the comments, and I will get back to you in terms of how to set that up. Here's the St. Louis Blues team that won the draft lottery this year. Obviously, they took Eric Johnson first overall. You could see why they weren't that great of a team, lacking a lot of depth. Like Keith Tkachuk, great player. Scott Young was dropping off a lot. You can see he's 38 years old at this point. But then you have like below that, you have like young Stempniak. You have like Jamal Mayers. Below that, you have like Ryan Johnson, Jay McClement. You have Mike Glumak in the lineup. Fun fact, this guy scored a couple goals against me in NHL 07, and that was the day that my original Xbox decided to start smoking, and it, well, not exploded on me, but it died on me. Like, it started smoking, my game got fried inside, and Mike Glumak might have been the reason why, who knows. Then we have Syracuse, who's Columbus AHL affiliate. Like I said, I kind of revamped a couple of AHL teams just because that way you don't have like Syracuse Crunch looking like a Tampa Bay affiliate instead of a Columbus one. This is the Lightning after they won the Stanley Cup in 04, and you could definitely see they definitely fell apart a little bit after the Stanley Cup win. I mean, they have still great pieces, obviously. Richard St. Louis LeCavalier. They brought in Vakov Prospal, but it was kind of dipping off in terms of like depth. Like you have like Seaback, Artukin, Craig, DeMaio, like Ifinasenkov. It's not a great bottom six for this team. You head to Toronto. This is a really weird time period for the Toronto Maple Leafs because you have Jason Allison, who came back from injury. He didn't play in 03-04, but he was now on the Leafs in 05-06. And then you also have like Eric Lindros as a Leaf, which is still one of the weirdest things. It's probably even weirder than him being a Dallas Star, in my opinion. But yeah, this Toronto team is interesting. They didn't make the playoffs that year, but they might make the playoffs in the simulation just because they actually did have some pretty good pieces. I think the main reason they didn't make the playoffs is this defensive core isn't great. You could see like Kavanagh. I could have made him maybe a little bit better. But yeah, basically they only had McCabe and Caberlet on the back end that were actually solid. And then also they ran into probably injury problems because Allison wasn't really, like he was kind of on his last legs durability-wise. And Eric Lindros definitely was as well. Like, I made his durability a 40 because he barely played this season and he barely played in Dallas this season after this as well. And yeah, Ed Belfour dropped off considerably after the lockout. Like in the before the lockout, he was one of the best goalies in the league, no question about it. After the lockout, this guy dropped off a cliff, and then he was retired by the end of 06-07 with the Florida Panthers. You also have J.S. Aubin, who was actually the best Leaf goalie this season. Like, he actually went on like an 8-0-1 stretch, I think. And he actually had some really good goals saved above expected. And yeah, Telquist still kind of a meh backup. But yeah, that's the Leafs team. We head to Vancouver. Not very good, but obviously if they brought in Roberto Luongo, this defensive or goaltending core would look a lot better. Dan Cloutier's durability has been knocked down a lot as well, because he was pretty much on his last legs. And defensively, there is the Canucks defensive core. This team didn't make the playoffs, but they obviously did once they brought in Luongo. But it's kind of a weird scene. Like Keith Carney is a Canuck, Eric Weinrich is a Canuck. Those are things that I don't really associate those guys with. And then forward-wise, Naslund's dropping off a little bit. Sedins are getting better, which is good. Bertuzzi's kind of dropping off too. And same with like Morrison and whatnot. Like the only players that are getting better really on this team are like the Sedins, Ryan Kessler, who's down there that's young. Burrows would technically be getting better, that type of thing. And finally, the Washington Capitals. I had to make Ovechkin the same overall as Sidney Crosby just because I didn't want to say one is better than the other because they're all somebody would complain about it, and making them even at least kind of makes sense. Obviously, Ovechkin's 1 year older than Sidney Crosby. Or, yeah, a couple of years older than Sidney Crosby. So, basically, it just makes more sense for him to be the same overall and whatnot. And maybe Crosby will end up being better. Maybe Ovechkin will end up better. Maybe they'll have similar careers. It'll be interesting to see when you guys do, like, a season, like, all 25 years and see who ends up similarly better with my roster build. Because I honestly have no idea who would be the better of the two. Obviously, Ovechkin might score more goals, but Crosby maybe the better all-around player in terms of like assists and stuff. But yeah, this Caps team still not good. Obviously, they weren't good before the lockout, but this defensive core very not good. Like when your best defenders are Eminger and Morrison, it's not a great sign. Brian Muir and Jamie Heward and Jason Heward's Hayward. I was thinking of for basketball, but yeah, Heward and Muir. Both those guys were actually really good this season in terms of points, but the two of them actually didn't really play in the NHL that much over the last few years. Like Heward, this was his first time in the NHL as a full-time NHLer since 2002, I'm pretty sure. So, yeah, it was kind of a weird time period for Jamie Heward to get back into the lineup, but he was actually really solid. Mike Green wasn't at his offensive best yet. He was kind of struggling still, and he didn't really play that much. That's why he's kind of more of a depth defenseman for his team. But Washington had a lot of right-handed defenders. That's one thing. And goalie-wise, Kolzig was not doing as well as he used to do. Definitely still solid as a goaltender, but he was definitely getting closer to retirement at this point in time. So there's a little bit of an overview on the rosters. I know I kind of talked a little bit longer than I would like to because I want these videos to not be super long for you guys. But yeah, look for this roster out on Xbox Series X and S as soon as possible. It'll probably be up before this video is up likely. But it will have these exact same names as these type of files, so you'll have it saying Snipes Throwback 2005-06. And yeah, also check out the website so you guys can learn how to set that up. I will be getting player ratings and all that stuff on the website as soon as possible as well. But I am thinking about kind of like retweaking the website a little bit in terms of how it's laid out. So I probably will work on that first before putting up player ratings and that type of thing. But let me know what you think down below, and I'll see you guys next time.